Hello and welcome to the You Want Game podcast. My name is Sean Dorcelis. I'm a senior student at Syracuse University studying broadcasting and digital journalism with a concentration on sports culture. I am the host of today's episode of the You Want Game pod. Founded by Joe Branch and Bill Babora, You Want Game is a nonprofit organization that has helped many high school student athletes reach their potential in academics and athletics, as well as personal growth through life skills and career development. Through mentoring, workshops, and events, You Want Game brings professionals from various backgrounds to speak with high school student athletes and give them a look at the game behind the game. Please visit youwantgame.org for more information on the organization. And today on the You Want Game podcast, it is our pleasure to have our special guest, JP Abercrumbie. JP is the Associate Athletic Director for SOAR and the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at Rice University. She's a former NCAA Division I student athlete herself, as she was a member of the track and field team at Temple University. JP, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Sean. I'm excited about having the opportunity to talk to you today.
Likewise, the feeling is mutual. We're going to start, somewhat semi-chronologically here. So I mentioned you're a former Division I student athlete yourself. How did you go about choosing Temple as the place that you would further your academic and athletic careers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think for me, it starts even before I even knew I would go to college. We talked about this a little bit in the intro, but I was born on the West Coast. I grew up in the Midwest and I had family in the South. So for me, I was just looking to get east because that was going to be the only place where no one else had gone, uncharted waters, things of that nature for me to really find out who I wanted to be. When it came down to Temple in particular, there was a unique combination of not only the athletic experience that I would be able to have, being able to compete, being able to see more of the country that I than prior to growing up, being from the Midwest. But then I think also academically, it was a very sound school and also afforded me a lot of opportunities to pursue a few different paths. I think originally I went into the whole collegiate experience thinking I'm going to be a speech pathologist and that's what I'm going to do. I also knew that I might have some shifting interest, and of course that came up throughout my experience. But Temple also afforded me the opportunity to kind of pursue multiple academic paths if I did want to shift interest. And so that was something that just seemed like the best of both worlds for me when I was going through that process. And I remember stepping off the plane my first time in Philly, and I took in a nice little deep breath of winter air there, and I was like, this is home. I knew it instantly.
Wow, that is so great. Funny, so you've experienced all the different time zones then in the country at this point. So of course, You Want Game in our work with high school student athletes, a lot of them will be navigating that experience similar to one that you had mentioned. What advice would you have to high schoolers as they look for the place that they'll further their own academic careers?
Yeah, that's something I think about a lot because I also have the opportunity to interact with high school students in my current role, especially during the recruiting process. One of the things I tell them often is to ask questions, come prepared with questions and not just about, where you'll go or what gear you get and what freebies there are in this experience. But I think for me, it was about evaluating the people that I was going to spend a lot of my time with. So I think for me, luckily enough, I was able to find a good group of people who were going to challenge me to think bigger and think about more for myself than just the athletic experience. And that became true as I matriculated through school. I think one thing I encourage student athletes at the high school level to think about is understanding that, what's the best way to say this? Understanding that it's not just about what will happen in these next 3 to 4 years in terms of what you can get out of the experience, but you're evaluating that college as much as they're evaluating you. You don't always have to settle for that first offer that comes your way. You don't have to make that decision very hastily. Take your time, be intentional about it, because this is something that you want to have pride in 30, 40 years down the road.
You mentioned, some of the interaction you have with high school student athletes in your current role. Let's talk about your role at Rice. What does the day-to-day look like for you?
Well, no 2 days are ever alike. You mentioned, you mentioned my title in the beginning. I'm the Associate Athletic Director for SOAR, and then I also wear another hat as the Chief DE&I Officer for our department. So in the Associate Athletic Director for SOAR role, that's more of a player engagement, student athlete development type role. It's my job to oversee the personal growth and professional development opportunities that are afforded to all of our student athletes. So I work with all 365 across about 16 varsity sports programs. So everyone from your freshman walk-on football player through your scholarship tennis athlete who's international. So that means understanding the different demographics that we will have in each sport, as well as acknowledging what our student athletes bring with them when they come to campus, and really focusing on supporting their transitions in, through, and beyond Rice University successfully. So no 2 days ever look alike. I could be out at practice one day. I could be hosting a Zoom webinar, especially in this environment, about values assessments. This Thursday, we have a summer internship workshop scheduled for our student athletes, just really helping them navigate the resources that are available while also making sure that they're prepped and poised for the application and recruitment processes of any of the opportunities that come their way. So I wish I had a more succinct answer for you, but it's a lot of fun. I'll tell you that.
No, I think that's the perfect, valuable insight that the students, the youth need to understand, that sort of flexibility, that versatility in a role that, as long as it's exciting, as you said it is, you'll come to realize that you got to wear a lot of different hats, I'm sure, on a lot of different days. So, JP, what experiences did you have as a student athlete yourself that have shaped the way that you work now as an associate AD?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think for me, it's more about the experiences that happened in addition to the athletics. I feel like the athletic piece was almost predictable. Like, especially having been a high school student athlete, I knew what competition was going to be like. I'd been in that mode. I'd competed on some pretty big stages, even all the way up to the Junior Olympics. So it's like I had that kind of in my bag. But what I wasn't prepared for was my first semester of college classes. High school classes might have been a little easier to navigate. I think also in terms of team dynamics, everyone was from the same school, everyone is from maybe my same classes, but when you get to that collegiate level, I had teammates from all over the world, and understanding what their experiences were like or what they were bringing to the table in terms of opportunities for me to learn from them, to grow with them, to grow alongside them, and really put together a comprehensive team. I don't think I was prepared for that. And I think in addition to that, just navigating the collegiate landscape was completely different. Has anyone ever heard of a registrar's office prior to? I didn't know what that was. And so I think there was just a learning curve in terms of the terminology that was used at that level, that even though I went to a very well-resourced institution for my high school, there was still a learning curve that I had to be able to be prepared to navigate. And I'm lucky that I had some people in my corner to help me do that.
I can completely relate to that. The registrar note anecdote, that's so funny. That is really like one of the—
What do they do?
It becomes such an integral part of your collegiate experience, obviously, but you've never heard that word before stepping foot onto campus, without a doubt. So speaking more to your current role, as the chief of the program, the athletic department, chief diversity, equity, and inclusion, those have become very buzzy words over the last year. The departments have grown, they've become more well-resourced. Since you've taken on the role, what were some of the biggest goals that you had, going into accepting that position? And what are some of the accomplishments that you're most proud of since you started working in it?
Yeah, I really, wow, that's a huge question. Even just a moment of reflection, I think there's a lot that's happened, particularly in the last year, but even as we look at what was happening globally beyond the confines of Rice University, beyond the hedges, there's so much that has happened in this world as it relates to DE&I, which you've noticed that may or may not influence the resources I have, the amount of buy-in, the way that we all communicate, collaborate, engage with one another. I think when I look at my role specific to Rice University, I am in a good position to be at an institution that acknowledges that, hey, our institutional past has not been the best when we talk about creating a more equitable and inclusive environment. So I think at this point in time, we are primed to make some changes. Now, like any change, there might be some resistance, there might be some hesitancy, just a lack of knowledge. And I think that's where I've been able to come in terms of making sure that we have the resources for education, that we are evaluating the policies and procedures that we embark on or create on a day-to-day basis, and then ultimately that we continue the conversation in a helpful way. So what does that look like? We formed, in the athletic department, we formed the OWLIN Task Force, which is a group of student athletes, coaches, and staff that come together to kind of make sure that we're staying on topic with those three areas that I mentioned: education, policy, and continuing the conversation. From a resource level, making sure that we can acknowledge some of the more ethnic, religious, gender related holidays, awareness campaigns, months that are coming up or that have happened. So particularly this year in 2021, looking at how do we celebrate or even just acknowledge Black History Month in a meaningful, non-performative way. How do we do that how do we champion not only Women's History Month, but the amazing women student athletes that we have in our department right now? Because I don't know if you follow Rice University or Rice Athletics, but our women's teams are killing it. So just making sure that we give them what they're owed, and then also make sure that we're elevating the expectations around our men's programs and the resources around our men's programs so that they can get up to the same level as our women. I'm going to tout them a little bit more. But I think it's also a unique opportunity for me as a sport administrator of a male sport to see how I can play a role in making sure that the resources are allocated appropriately, and that we do everything that we can to set that championship level expectation across the board.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about, it's very timely given that March, Women's History Month. Let's talk more about women's sports, especially in the collegiate space. We've seen as recently as this past month with the NCAA tournament, exposing some of the inequities, the inequalities that women's sports and men's sports have at their disposal. In what ways do you feel like you can be a part of the change that we are seeking?
Well, I think the first thing is trying to better identify what that change is. You mentioned in particular to the basketball tournaments, are we striving for equity or are we really seeking equality? And I think a lot of times when we look at diversity, equity, and inclusion, sometimes people mistake equality and equity to mean the same thing. And I think if we look at the history of our country and acknowledge the areas where underrepresented classes, whether that be from a racial standpoint, from a gender standpoint, a sexual orientation, ability standpoint, whatever that may be, where there are underrepresented classes, in order to get to equality, you may have to do some things differently from an equity standpoint. And so you may have to provide additional resources for one group or additional opportunities for one group that don't exist for others. And that's okay. We have to be okay with not having everything be completely equal in order to get to that point. I think it's funny thinking about women's athletics in particular and my own student athlete experience. I'm a product of being able to have opportunities for Title IX, but I know that this next class of student athletes coming up after me probably don't even know what Title IX is or why it's in existence or what the importance of it is, and maybe even have a distorted view of it, particularly as it relates to men's sports opportunities. So I see it as my role to do a better job of educating others and facilitating those conversations. Ultimately, what we talk about in our athletic department is me making sure that I create those spaces for that dialogue to happen, for that knowledge to be shared, and for us to move toward more of an equitable and inclusive environment so that we can someday reach equality.
And those are, just some of the challenges that we're talking about that the women's collegiate athletes themselves face. And now you, in your role, as you've, climbed the ladder on the director side, on the professional side, what challenges have you faced being a woman on the administrative level, understanding that this is an industry that men have long had, their influence, their roles completely overtaken?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And honestly, I think I want to take a little bit different of an approach to that, acknowledging that I'm a Black identifying woman. So for me, there are many times where I've been discriminated against for just being a woman. There are many times I've been discriminated against for being Black in a predominantly white space. But I think that intersectionality and that, focus on being a Black woman is something that I just I can't not live with, right? Like
Right.
that's me, that's who I bring into the world. And I think if I sat there and I dissected the instances where it happened, was it because I was Black or was it because I was a woman? That's not going to help me or the people around me get better. But there are certainly moments where I've had to think about how I carry myself into certain spaces, how I communicate certain intentions. Am I smiling too much or am I not smiling enough? That being called out. Even things about like what I'm wearing and is it too provocative or is it professional? I think those are expectations of me and maybe even unwritten rules that I have to follow or just be aware of when it comes to navigating life in these predominantly male spaces. But then you take that up a notch when it's a woman in sports. I'm always challenged on what I know about sports, right? Like I'm standing on the sideline of a game supporting our student athletes and our coaches. And I've had fans, I've had event staff workers, I've just had random people come up and say, oh, whose wife or girlfriend are you? There's never this expectation that I'm there for my job or that I'm there to serve a purpose. And so there are moments where I push back and, I can respectfully tell them that I'm there to do a job. But I think that's something that men, particularly in this space, don't even have to have question about whether they're working or not. It's expected that a man is in a sports role and kind of in a leadership role around the department or around a certain team. But for me, it's still an anomaly. And I hope to continue to have that representation to show other people, particularly other Black women, that they can work in these spaces to help normalize that.
Powerful answer. Thank you for being so candid and sharing that. The impact that you've made at Rice, you just look at the bio. You look at your bio on the website, you can see what that's been. But prior to being at Rice, you held roles at Mississippi State and Cal Berkeley. One of the ways that the gauges for success is impact. So how do you define impact?
I think for me, especially in the role that I'm in, I look at the depth of my relationships. I'm a very relational person and leader, and particularly in the role that I have, I tell people I build bridges for a living. I get to meet little Timmy when he comes in on his recruiting visit or as a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed freshman who doesn't know how to do their own laundry, and I get to support them through each year. I feel like you empathize with that experience a little too much there.
I'm not that far removed from it myself.
So watching little Timmy come in or meeting him and his family in the recruiting process, and then seeing how they mature throughout their entire process, both as a student, as an athlete, as a human, as a person, as a citizen of this world, and really challenging them to become more. And then there are fewer things that are more humbling to me where I reflect on the time that I spent with little Timmy, thinking about all the times I probably just wanted to bang my head off the wall because they weren't understanding something while they were on campus. But 4 years down the road, even 10 years down the road, little Timmy reaches out and says, hey, I was thinking about you and I really want to say thank you for what you did to me or for me. Or I'm sitting in my office on campus at Rice University right now, and in the corner over there, there's a little baby goat that came from one of my former student athletes, and it just came as an anonymously unmarked box one day. But one of my former student athletes wanted to send a goat to the goat and acknowledge everything that I did for them. And so things like that are very humbling to me as I think about that. And so when you talk about impact or when you talk about legacy, I think all of the people who have some JP-isms that come out of their mouth or the stock statements that I've been known to say. Little Timmy is a common fictitious athlete that rolls around these campuses and these halls of everywhere I've been. But I think those are the things that I look back on and seeing how I've been able to influence the lives of others, because ultimately the programs and the systems that I've been able to put in place, those may change. But I think those relationships and the way that I challenge people to think more for themselves and to achieve more are what are going to be my lasting legacy.
So you're, in your mind, the greatest impact that you can make is the impact that you make on others. Yeah. Makes sense. So, those personal relationships, the bridges that you built, you said, something else that goes along with working in an athletic department the events, the programs, these things that you're a part of, what have been some of your favorite events that you've worked on in your career?
In my career. So it's funny, I'm thinking about an event that's kind of similar for each of the institutions where I've been in. I've gotten to put my own little spin on it, but essentially it was a career development event that involved bringing back alumni to be a part of engaging with current student athletes, sharing their wisdom, things of that nature. Although you mentioned, Temple and my student athlete experience there earlier, although I'm an owl, a Temple owl, I will never be a Rice owl. It's just a bird of another feather, but it's fine. I can rock with that. There are owls all over this office. And when I think about my own student athlete experience and how much it meant to me to have other people who have run across this campus or sat in the same seats that I sat in, I strive to bring that to every environment that I'm in. So whether that means being able to partner with some NFL coaches and former NFL athletes out in California and revamp what they did from a career development standpoint, or really bring something to Mississippi State that had never been done before in terms of a networking night and bringing in alumni, bringing in corporate partners, bringing in prospective employers for the student athletes there, or even as simple at Rice as having a Black male leadership luncheon for our student athletes of color, and really being able to find alumni of color, bringing them back to have a real talk conversation about navigating life, about encouraging the current student athletes to think about themselves as more than just athletes or more than just their sport, and really providing those links so that people can be positioned to prosper for life after whatever their campus environment looks like.
So, you had this event on Thursday, you mentioned, and, a lot of the work that you've done in terms of networking and alumni outreach. And one of the goals for the SOAR program you mentioned is assisting student athletes with those sort of career development opportunities. If you were hiring an intern for your office, what qualities would you be looking for in that candidate?
Well, I hope whoever is listening is interested in working for me, because that is something that happens often. So spoiler alert, if somebody is looking for an internship, when I hire for interns, I think about, I'm a very values-driven type of individual, and 3 of my values are communication, collaboration, and consistency. So when it comes to interns, I hope that, I usually require some type of resume to be put together. And so however you communicate on paper, I hope you can also articulate that in spoken word, or just that consistency of being able to show up in spaces. So if I look at your resume and I can probably tell that mom and dad wrote it based off how you're showing up in a conversation with me, I'm looking at you sideways. Or if I see the communication that you sent me in terms of emails and just that professionalism side, you have that on point, but I go check your social media and it's looking a little wild. If you're already my intern, we're going to have a conversation. If you're in the application process, you might be put into the no pile. And so I think about communicating consistently and making sure that who you are in real life is exactly like who you are virtually, and vice versa, because it's not 2 alternate worlds. And I think those are things that, particularly for today's high school students and even middle school students, that seem far-fetched. But I would encourage you to think about how you show up online and in real life.
I've got my notes tab open here, so I could take some of these notes down too. JP, I'm sure there are so many student athletes that have worked with you that would consider you to be a mentor to them. I mean, you got the baby goat, that's a sign itself right there. What role have mentors played in your life?
To say the least. I think it's funny, kind of thinking about who I consider to be mentors. I don't know if in the process of them pouring into me, if I would have identified that while I was growing up, but it's certainly humbling to kind of sit back and reflect on how I got where I am today and say, oh, I wouldn't be here if that person didn't tell me to stop what I was doing, or if that person didn't encourage me, or if that person didn't, take 5 minutes of their time and just pour into me. So, when I think about paying it forward, when I think about being a mentor to others, it's about acknowledging that and maybe even having the not see in themselves and to let them know. So I think about creating those opportunities for people to be comfortable to feel challenged, but ultimately to reach their biggest potential.
Something that you mentioned that really resonated with me is, maybe not even identifying these moments, these people as mentors at the time, but really just relationships generally. So can you speak a little bit now to the importance of relationships? Of course, in life, we recognize that, but particularly when it comes to your career.
Yeah, well, even thinking about what you said for mentors, I some of my greatest mentors were people who really made me upset or said something that I didn't really agree with at the time, but I needed to hear it. So I encourage people to think about mentors as those who may say what you need and not always say what you want to hear. And so sometimes, especially as a high school student, big shot coming into college, big fish from a little pond, big fish from a big pond, it gets hard to hear that humbling word that you may need, but may not feel great in that time. Relationships have been important beyond belief for me, both personally and professionally. When I think about how I got to Rice specifically, quite frankly, it's the result of relationships I had with people who I worked with prior throughout my time at Mississippi State, but then another who I met through friends of friends and friends, and we found out that we had lots of life connections, even down to being born in the same week. So my relationships have been very key to not only who I've become, but how I've gotten where I am. And I think sometimes we talk about networking a lot, and people are like, "Oh, great, I got this person on LinkedIn, or I got, I can text them over here, or I slid in their DMs over there," and that's great. But I want to take it one step further and not just say it's about who you know, but about who knows you and who's willing to advocate for you when you're not in the room. So that gets into sponsorship a little bit, but I think it's important to see relationships as having depth to them, as being more than just, oh, I got this person's this name or this number in my phone book, but really having some in-depth detail, know-how, some substance to it, so that when you're not in the room or when you're not a part of conversations, those opportunities are still open for you to be able to seize.
Well, this conversation was filled with depth and substance. So thank you so much for being so insightful and candid with me. And then, of course, to all our great viewers that will get a chance to see and listen to this as well. So that's our time for today. Thank you once again to JP Abercrumbie for joining us. Where can we find you on social media, LinkedIn? What are your handles?
Yeah, LinkedIn is my name. I know it's a little complicated, especially with the whole Abercrombie part, but yeah, JP Abercrombie on LinkedIn, just JP on Twitter. Get a lot of those JP-isms and hashtag be greats. If you follow me in that way, that would be awesome.
All right. Well, we'll make a note of that, definitely. And listeners, we would love to hear from you as well. Follow our movement and join the conversation at UOnGame. That's at UOnGame on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Until next time, thank you very much. I'm Sean Dursellis. Have a good one.